Hi everybody, this is my third video today. Things are happening thick and fast and it seems we all have to step to it. An army of keyboard warriors is what is needed right now. So I did make a video about this recently and I'll leave a link underneath it, underneath this video, to that video I made and a couple of others that I've made today. Basically, my video was covering this consultation document because the government's asked for, well, it set up this open consultation on distributing vaccines and treatments for COVID-19 and flu. And it is disturbing that they actually want to give people flu vaccines along with the COVID-19 proposed vaccine and treatments, which, whether it's a vaccine or a treatment, it's a new biotechnology. It is gene editing. It can be given through a treatment or through a vaccine. And so basically what the government is saying, is proposing here, is that because we're in the middle of a pandemic, there's not enough time to do all the studies and peer reviews because, you know, we're dealing with a serious health hazard. So therefore, the licensing authority that normally grants licenses for medical products to be used in Britain's NHS, for example, then they have to have been through the peer reviews and rigorous testing and trials and what have you in order to be allowed for wider public use. But the government is claiming that the licensing authority can authorise use of these vaccines and treatments, these experimental vaccines and treatments for COVID-19, without a licence, and the vaccines and medical treatments to be, well, the vaccines to be delivered by non-health professionals, and nobody's liable, there's no liability, and all to be going ahead with assistance of the military. So we're talking about mandatory vaccination, you see. So, you know, just to give you an idea of what it is really all about, I'm going to share this letter which has been sent to my local council, my GP and local health team, and I've invited people to send, you know, copy and paste and send to their own councils within the next 24 hours, because the consultation ends at midnight tomorrow night on the 18th, though the government has said that they will still be receiving any input after that date, you know, that they still welcome people to continue with the consultation after that date, probably, you know, until the end of the month really. But they've put this closing date from the 18th. So I've asked people to copy and send it to their own, and you can get onto my Facebook, it is public, Deborah Mahmoudier, and find it on my wall and do the same. So has region, you know, I put my local council region name there, and in that bit you would put your own council or GP surgery or whichever. Has the council read and responded to the UK government consultation papers on mandatory treatments and vaccines for COVID and flu? If not, why not? You have until 11:59 PM on 18th of the 9th 2020 to respond. Here is the link. UK government is proposing mandatory unlicensed experimental flu and COVID vaccines and treatments to be administered by non-health professionals recruited from among UK public, and no one along that chain from production, dealership, administration, etc. to be liable for adverse impacts. In face of the evidence, what's being proposed is criminal. This is the kind of vaccine treatment being developed at Oxford, and this is it. It is actually gene editing, gene therapy, AstraZeneca. That's what's going to be rolled out in Britain. Okay. We are dealing with a new virus that by now is known to have an average of 0.1 to 0.6% risk, depending on age and health. Children have an almost 0% risk. According to the sample of evidence as shared below, there is a very real risk that 1/4 of the vaccinated treated populace could develop, e.g. leukemia, as an adverse reaction to the COVID vaccine, to the vaccine treatment. We are talking about new biotechnology, gene editing vaccines and treatments. All the studies thus far have proven they have impacted a far greater risk of damages than the pathogens they're designed to inhibit, the influenza vaccine and COVID. Now, this is an article that is basically sharing evidence that connects COVID-19 with the influenza vaccine, and that the people who received the influenza vaccine have been more susceptible to COVID-19. So it is very disturbing that they're talking about flu and COVID-19 vaccines, that they want to not only forcibly inject people or treat people with this new gene therapy for COVID-19, but simultaneously give people an influenza vaccine as well. So, you know, this is very important, the information here that's telling us from medical observation that actually it looks very strongly that people who've had the influenza vaccine are more susceptible to COVID. So what damage is, so it's double the damage than a lot of the people who are being, therefore who are receiving might be receiving these COVID treatments and the flu vaccine might, as a direct result, develop COVID. So then we've got all the studies here from DNA damage from CRISPR. You know, I will leave you all the links here, and I'll leave you the link to my Facebook page. You can go through them all. Serious adverse event from gene therapy, you know, I mean, basically. And it says the results have since been confirmed in 4 additional patients. That 1 out of 4, because there were 5 people tested in the first study, and 1 of them was a placebo. But out of the 4 people that received the actual therapy, 1 developed leukemia 2.5 years later. And they tried the experiment again, and the same thing happened again. So if you then put that onto the whole population, that would be 1/4 of the population developing leukemia if that treatment had been rolled out. I mean, this treatment was for something different to COVID-19, but it really doesn't make any difference. It's, you know, the connection with cancer is just huge. And this is from February 25th, 2020. Researchers are substantially undercounting gene editing errors, concludes a new paper. In describing these findings, the researchers called such oversights serious pitfalls of gene editing. And the quotes there, in all, the new results suggest that gene editing is more error-prone than thought, and further, that identifying and discarding defective and unwanted outcomes is not as easy as generally supposed. If the experimental vaccines and treatments adversely impact even just 1% of the UK population, that will be far higher than anything yet inflicted by COVID, and with risk to children in particular, thereby increasing in real terms to 0.10% above COVID. It's ridiculous. Why should your residents be subject to any such risk? Does the council no longer have any duty of care? In face of such horror as military-enforced experimental gene editing vaccines, it is surely time to turn off the government and media propaganda and actually examine the evidence, i.e. check out what Dr. Mike Yeadon has stated on the consultation, and please do bear in mind that he is a former CSO and VP, Allergy and Respiratory Research Head with Pfizer Global R&D and co-founder of Ziarco Pharma Limited. Like Dr. Yeadon, myself and many other UK citizens are feeling suspicious and under threat. I hope the Council will respond to the consultation, which is open to response from all UK citizens. I hope you will stand by people's human rights and the law. Kind regards, Deborah Mahmoodieh. Now, that's, as I say, you can get onto my Facebook and you can copy and share that and send it to your own council, and I suggest you do it tonight so they've got it for tomorrow morning. Now, as I stated earlier, what the government's claiming here is that because we're in the middle of a pandemic and they've not got time for peer reviews and all the studies for these COVID vaccines and treatments, so they're just going to have to ignore all that, and therefore the licensing authority can legally, on the strength of the pandemic, because the numbers are so high, the infection rate, the R rate is so high, that, you know, we've just got to get this vaccine out, and so therefore the licensing authority can authorise an unlicensed product for mass public use. That's basically the gist of what they're saying, because obviously if the medical licensing authority were to grant a licence to these products, these COVID treatments and vaccines, then they would be liable if people suffered damages, because they have given a licence to products that have not been through the peer reviews and necessary studies, you see. That's the fact. So therefore they're not willing to make themselves liable by actually giving a licence. They're asking us to accept non-peer reviewed, something that is actually still in the experimental stage, to accept that because of the risks of COVID, because look, the R rate is so high. So what they're using to determine the R rate are these PCR tests. Now, I have been through study after study. I've done historical searches on the internet to check out this PCR testing, and I found that it is very, very suspect, and that they are known to give a very high percentage of false positives. And this has been covered, you know, from years ago. I'll see if I've still got a few of the links and leave them under this, but really, you know, this is the study that you need to focus on right now, and it has been reprinted August 18, 2020. I think it was originally published on the 26th of the 4th, 2020, and it's you can see it's a perfectly legitimate science health site, MedRexiv, Yale, British Medical Journal, I think that is, CSH, all, you know, it is a reputable site, and for purposes here that it's just a part of the study, because there's the PDF that you can have a look at. But basically what they're saying here is diagnosing COVID-19 infection, the danger of over-reliance on positive test results. So basically, unlike previous epidemics, in addressing COVID-19, nearly all international health organisations and national health ministries have treated a single positive result from a PCR-based test as confirmation of infection, even in asymptomatic persons without any history of exposure. This is based on a widespread belief that positive results in these tests are highly reliable. However, data on PCR-based tests for similar viruses show that PCR-based testing produces enough false positive results to make positive results highly unreliable over a broad range of real-world scenarios. This has clinical and case management implications and affects an array of epidemiological statistics, including the asymptomatic ratio, prevalence and hospitalisation and death rates. Steps should be taken to raise awareness of false positives, reduce their frequency and mitigate their effects. In the interim, positive results in asymptomatic individuals that haven't been confirmed by a second test should be considered suspect. Okay, So what they're saying is as I and many other people through our research have realised, is that these PCR tests are very suspect, are producing false positives. They are unreliable. We can't rely on them to state definitively how high the R rate is, basically. You see. And like the government's claiming it's facing a pandemic and therefore they have to roll out mass-produced experimental vaccines without a licence and force the public, with assistance of the military, so at the point of a gun if necessary, to have these new treatments and vaccines that are unlicensed and haven't been through peer reviews. But we're going to accept that because of the dangers of COVID-19. Okay? And all on the strength of the R rate and the tests. Then why shouldn't we, the public, and every single medical health professional in Britain be entitled to do the same with a study like this? Because, as I say, this study hasn't come out of fresh air. It's based on trial after trial, study after study. As I say, I have read through them, through history. I've done historical searches into these PCR tests and found, time after time, they're seriously lacking. So, you know, we're having our human rights removed today. People are being placed under house arrest today. People are losing jobs and businesses today, all on the strength of the numbers now, the testing, how many people are testing positive. And, you know, asymptomatic people apparently should be tested twice. But we know for a fact that you test positive, bang, that goes on the government figures, bang, the R rate goes up. Even if people did get a second test, doubtful if they tested positive twice, the test would be, you know, they would be reported twice as having COVID-19. So why shouldn't we take this study at face value, in face, when we think that on the strength of the R numbers, on the strength of the amount of people diagnosed positive with COVID, they are justifying lockdowns, justifying rolling out their vaccine. Oh, but you see here what it says. This article is a reprint and has not been peer reviewed. What does this mean? In brackets. It reports new medical research that has yet to be evaluated and so should not be used to guide clinical practice. Okay? Do you see the double standard being used here? That we, the public, and health professionals should take no notice of this study. We should just totally ignore it. You see? Because it hasn't been peer reviewed. But we should all support and receive an experimental gene editing vaccine. You know, literally something that's going to be hacking up our DNA, rewriting our DNA, with serious risks involved as well, as I've just shown. We're supposed to accept that and ignore the need. We can ignore the need of peer reviews and, you know, all the usual protocols, all the usual regulations and requirements for vaccines and treatments. We should ignore the studies showing us and the medical observations that people who've had flu vaccines have had the worst cases of COVID-19. and the highest rate of fatalities. It could be coincidence, but there needs to be a study. But we haven't got time for the studies, have we? Because they want to inject us now. So we're going to have to need to do the same as the government then, aren't we? We're going to need to rely on these kind of studies, on the studies that are telling us that flu vaccines actually can make COVID worse, or that the gene editing vaccines and treatments themselves can make people more susceptible to flu and other strains. You know, my grandmother used to say, what's good for the goose is good for the gander, and it seems to me that we're under threat here. And when we're facing such horror as forced, military-enforced experimental vaccines that are going to mess about with our DNA, then all based on the strength of these test results, then actually I think that we should be able, and every medical professional in this world needs to say, well, actually, we're going to take this study, along with all the other studies that have been done over the years about these PCR tests, we are going to take this seriously. Because we already know that the death rates, the fatalities have been bumped up, as even this government has now admitted. But it's like, oh, that was down the line. We can forget about that now, because now we're focusing on the R numbers, because now we're mass testing everybody. Oh yeah, we've just taken 100 billion out of the NHS budget, 2/3 of the NHS budget, to test people for this apparently deadly virus that it turns out wasn't as anywhere near as deadly as it was claimed to be to warrant the lockdowns. And now we've got the evidence to prove that, but nonetheless we'll just keep pushing on with the agenda, we'll just keep pushing on with it. The cases are going up, right, oh that's it, whole of the northeast of England now on lockdown, and blah blah blah. But as I say, when it comes right down to it, if they can turn round and say, well, we're going to issue this, we're going to authorise an unlicensed medical products to be used on the British public because of the pandemic, we equally have a right, we the people, regardless of what profession we are or not, have a right to say, well, actually, we're going to stand by these studies because the risks posed by you, Mr. Government, and your experimental gene editing vaccines are far greater than COVID. And we have evidence that severely undermines your current narratives and the figures that you bombarding us with daily. So, you know, this should be used to guide clinical practice, especially when it appears that our government can ignore the peer reviews for things as serious as gene editing vaccines, and they want to mandatory vaccinate every single 66 million people in Britain with it, and to be administered by non-health professionals, and even put children at a higher risk, as children especially, at a higher risk than COVID itself. And even if they came out and said, all right, well, only people over 50 are going to have it. No, that has to be by consent, because you're talking about actually injecting something into somebody's body. Here we're talking about a study that does not involve actually injecting people with stuff or feeding them a treatment. Because, you know, vaccines, you know, you can either have a vaccine with as an injection, or it can be through a treatment. The same gene editing stuff is both vaccine and treatments they've used. So, you know, I hope that you understand how important this is. And, you know, that you will go through it. Like I say, you can preview the PDF. I think that we should ignore the fact that it hasn't been peer reviewed for now because of the risks to our health and human rights as being posed by ignorance of the usual protocols that, well, would ordinarily protect us from receiving experimental vaccines that could severely damage our health in far worse ways than anything that COVID-19 could inflict. And especially when that same vaccine is only being rolled out on the strength of the numbers. You know, and I think this is a very important thing about asymptomatic individuals haven't been confirmed with a second test. And yes, while there can be false negatives, it appears that the problem isn't with false negatives. The problem is with false positives, because there are so many pathogens that can include, you know, that can basically, a PCR-based test could be picking up on a common cold. And that so many other things that produce these RNA strands, exosomes. It has all been covered. And I think medical health professionals in particular, you know, we're talking about the DNA of humanity here and our children. I mean, it's even stated that these gene editing treatments and vaccines can actually impact the body, our DNA, in such a way that, you know, tomorrow's children could be born with defects as a direct result of these vaccines and the way that they are altering our DNA, because they alter the whole body's DNA. This is unacceptable. And then to tell us that, oh no, we should ignore any study that hasn't been peer reviewed, that questions the results of the PCR test. We should ignore that, and we should also ignore the fact that this proposed vaccine and treatment hasn't been peer reviewed. It is all outrageous, very, very disturbing, and we do all need to step to it. So, you know, do please get on my Facebook page, download this document, download it, copy and paste it, send it to your council. All the links are there. Knowledge is power. Your councillors probably don't know any of this. A lot of your GP surgeries won't know any of this. They're too busy to be able to spend all the time doing this kind of research. Send them this link as well. Because it appears to me that this is like a Cold War. And as I said at the start, it is going to take an army of keyboard warriors to get to work and bombard your councils, your MPs, everybody. I mean, I will be sending it to my MP. I'll be sending a copy to my MP tonight. Because, you know, COVID just, according to the evidence, we know that it is only the same as regular flu, you know, if not slightly worse, because it is a new virus and we haven't all got an immunity to it yet. But, you know, as far as I know, and so many other people know who've contacted me, we know that this has been out well before January. People were having symptoms in August, in September, October, November, December. This has already run through the herd in that sense. And everything's been backward, you know. Because really the testing should have started straight away, and anybody suspect, yeah, alright, then you stay in for a couple of weeks. That would have been the way to do it. And then if people were literally dropping down in the streets, as they were trying to show us in China, from China, then yes, you would take steps to protect the population. But it seems to me this isn't about protecting the populace at all. It's damaging the populace. It's denying our human rights, and now wants to experiment on us all with a gene editing treatment or vaccine. And, you know, what else would we expect from people who for centuries have been claiming that the common mass of people on planet Earth are genetically inferior? And here they are now. What have they developed, this top 1%, through their corporate pharmaceuticals and what have you? What have they developed? A treatment that does genuinely pose a risk of fundamentally damaging our DNA. Actually making us genetically inferior. Actually leaving us genetically inferior. So actually achieving what they've said all along we are, as a mass, we're all generally genetically inferior because, you know, we haven't managed to amass $200 billion in an offshore tax haven account. Apparently that makes us genetically inferior because we do an ordinary job of work. And here they are now hoping to enforce the proof of it. You know, it's like, well, actually, we're not genetically inferior. Oh, look, now you are. Now we are, aren't we? And who will have damaged us? Who will have damaged our DNA? The very people who falsely judged us genetically inferior. So I think that we have a duty. We have a duty to take this very, very seriously now. Like I say, as my grandma said, what's good for the goose is good for the gander.